September 17, 1944, marked one of the most audacious operations in military history when Allied paratroopers descended into the Netherlands as part of Operation Market Garden. The 82nd Airborne Division had one critical objective that would determine the success or failure of the entire campaign: capture the massive road bridge spanning the Waal River at Nijmegen intact before German engineers could demolish it. The bridge stretched nearly 2,000 feet across dark waters and represented the only route northward toward Arnhem, where British forces desperately awaited reinforcement. Without this steel artery, the advance would stall and thousands of soldiers would be trapped behind enemy lines. Before we continue with this extraordinary account, tell us in the comments which city you are listening from, so we can connect with all our listeners around the world. Among the paratroopers who landed in the fields outside Nijmegen was Private James Sullivan, a wiry 23-year-old from Pennsylvania who had volunteered for airborne duty after Pearl Harbor. Sullivan carried more than just his rifle and rations when he jumped from the transport plane. Strapped into a specially designed harness in the cargo hold was Major a German Shepherd who had been trained at the War Dog Training Center in Virginia as part of the Dogs for Defense program. Major had been donated by a family in Ohio who believed their loyal companion could serve a greater purpose in the fight against tyranny. The bond between Sullivan and Major had formed during 12 weeks of intensive training, where the dog learned to carry messages across battlefields, follow hand signals without barking, and remain calm under artillery fire. Major wore a leather collar with a small metal cylinder attached where urgent communications could be secured when radio equipment failed or was destroyed. The program had proven its worth across multiple theaters of war, with dogs saving countless lives by delivering messages through enemy fire that no human runner could survive. Sullivan trusted Major with his life, and the dog had already proven himself twice in France by locating wounded soldiers buried under rubble after bombardments. As the paratroopers assembled in the drop zone, German resistance intensified faster than intelligence reports had predicted. Machine gun nests opened fire from the surrounding towns, and mortar shells began falling among the American positions, creating chaos in the September afternoon. The original plan called for a swift advance to seize both ends of the bridge before nightfall. But SS Panzer units had moved into Nijmegen faster than expected, turning every street into a killing zone. Sullivan and his platoon found themselves pinned down in a bombed-out factory, 600 yards from the southern approach to the bridge, with ammunition running low and casualties mounting by the hour. Through the smoke and dust, Sullivan could see the bridge towers rising against the grey sky, like sentinels guarding the path to victory or doom. German soldiers had established defensive positions on both ends of the span, with heavy weapons covering every approach, while engineers prepared demolition charges that would send the entire structure into the river. Time was running out, and the Allied commanders needed to know the exact enemy strength and whether the bridge could still be taken by direct assault or if an alternative crossing point must be found. Sullivan looked down at Major, who sat calmly beside him despite the explosions, and realized that only one messenger could possibly make it through the firestorm that separated them from command headquarters. Captain Morris, the platoon leader, called Sullivan to the makeshift command post established in the factory basement, where maps were spread across a broken table illuminated by a single flickering lantern. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, with German reinforcements arriving from the east, and American forces scattered across multiple positions, unable to coordinate their attacks. Radio contact with battalion headquarters had been lost when a mortar round destroyed the communications truck, and 3 runners sent on foot had failed to return, leading everyone to assume they had been killed or captured. Morris explained that General Gavin needed immediate intelligence about the bridge defenses to decide whether to commit the reserve companies to a frontal assault or wait for British tanks to arrive from the south. Sullivan understood the weight of what was being asked as Morris handed him a folded map marked with enemy positions observed from the factory windows, along with a hastily written note describing their desperate situation and dwindling ammunition. The message had to reach headquarters 2 miles away across streets controlled by German snipers and machine gun teams, who were systematically eliminating any American movement. Morris looked at Major and then back at Sullivan, acknowledging that the dog represented their only realistic chance of getting vital information through enemy lines. Sullivan knelt beside Major and secured the metal cylinder containing the message to the special collar, while speaking softly to calm the animal who sensed the tension in every voice around them. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution, with Sullivan and two other soldiers creating a diversion by firing toward German positions on the western edge, while Major would sprint eastward through a series of destroyed buildings toward the last known location of headquarters. Major had been trained to navigate by scent and memory, capable of retracing routes over several miles, even through smoke and confusion. Sullivan showed Major a piece of cloth that belonged to Colonel Henderson, the battalion commander, whose scent the dog would follow across the chaotic battlefield. Major sniffed the cloth carefully, his tail wagging slightly as recognition dawned, showing he understood the mission that lay ahead, despite never having worked in terrain this hostile or under fire this intense. At exactly 1400 hours, Sullivan and his companions opened fire, drawing immediate response from German positions as machine gun tracers cut through the air and mortar rounds began impacting around the factory. In that moment of maximum distraction, Sullivan released Major with a hand signal, and the dog bolted from the building, staying low as he had been trained, moving through rubble with remarkable speed and agility. Sullivan watched through a gap in the wall as Major disappeared into the smoke, his heart pounding with fear and hope, knowing that everything depended on whether the dog could survive the next 20 minutes. The sound of battle intensified as German forces concentrated fire on the factory, believing a major American assault was beginning, unaware that a four-legged messenger was racing behind their lines. Major moved like a shadow through the devastated streets, his training overriding every natural instinct to seek shelter from the explosions that shook the ground beneath his paws. He passed burning vehicles and scattered equipment, following the scent trail that led toward the American command post, established in a church basement 3 blocks from the river. German soldiers shouted nearby, but Major remained silent as he had been taught, slipping through a gap in a garden wall, just as a patrol moved past on the street. His dark fur was covered in dust and debris, making him nearly invisible against the background of destruction, while his powerful legs carried him forward with unwavering determination toward the goal that Sullivan had set for him when they were together in the factory. Major reached the church without being spotted by enemy forces, but found the building had taken a direct hit from artillery, with the roof collapsed and walls crumbling inward. The dog circled the ruins, searching for the scent of Colonel Henderson, while the battle raged across Nijmegen, with the distinctive crack of rifles and thunder of tank guns echoing between buildings. Major's training included learning to search damaged structures for wounded soldiers, and he applied that same skill, now digging through loose bricks near a basement entrance where the scent grew stronger. After several minutes of frantic work, Major squeezed through a narrow opening into the darkness below, where American voices could be heard planning the next phase of the assault on the bridge. Colonel Henderson looked up in amazement as Major appeared from the rubble, shaking dust from his coat and approaching with the metal cylinder still attached to his collar. The soldiers gathered around as Henderson carefully removed the message from Sullivan's platoon, reading the detailed intelligence about German positions and the urgent request for ammunition resupply. Henderson immediately understood the value of what Major had delivered, recognizing that this information would allow them to coordinate a concentrated attack on the bridge defenses rather than wasting men in piecemeal assaults. He quickly wrote a response ordering Sullivan to hold position until nightfall, when a coordinated assault would begin with tank support and fresh troops brought forward under cover of darkness. Henderson secured his reply in the cylinder and gave Major a piece of his own uniform to carry back, ensuring Sullivan would know the message was authentic. But before releasing Major back into the chaos above, Henderson noticed something troubling through the church's broken windows. German forces had reposited machine guns along the route Major had used to reach the church, effectively closing off that avenue of escape. The dog would have to find an alternate path back to Sullivan's position, and Henderson worried that without guidance Major might become disoriented in unfamiliar streets or run directly into enemy patrols now on high alert. Several officers suggested keeping Major at headquarters and sending human runners after dark, but Henderson knew that Sullivan needed the response immediately to plan his defense and ration his remaining ammunition accordingly. Major was released from the church basement with a firm pat and a gesture toward the west where Sullivan waited. But the dog had barely cleared the building when German fire erupted from multiple directions. A Wehrmacht squad had spotted movement near the ruins and opened fire, believing American infantry was attempting to infiltrate their lines. Major instinctively dropped flat behind a low wall as bullets chipped stone above his head, demonstrating the remarkable training that had prepared him for combat conditions. He waited motionless for nearly 5 minutes until the firing subsided, then began moving parallel to his original route, using destroyed storefronts and rubble piles for concealment. His natural intelligence, combined with months of training, allowed him to adapt to changing circumstances in ways that amazed even his handlers back in the States. The journey back proved far more dangerous than the initial run because German forces were now actively searching the area, convinced that American scouts were operating behind their front lines. Major twice had to hide while enemy soldiers passed within feet of his position, their boots crunching on broken glass and voices harsh with tension. During one terrifying moment, a German officer actually looked directly at where Major crouched in the shadows of a burnt vehicle, but apparently mistook the dog for debris or a dead animal among the carnage. Major remained frozen until the patrol moved on, then continued westward, driven by loyalty to Sullivan and the training that had made returning to his handler an overwhelming imperative stronger than fear or hunger or exhaustion. Sullivan checked his watch for the 100th time as afternoon stretched into early evening with no sign of Major returning from the desperate mission. The firefight around the factory had diminished to sporadic sniper exchanges, as both sides conserved ammunition and regrouped for what everyone knew would be a decisive night battle. Sullivan's platoon had suffered 4 wounded men during the earlier diversion, including Morris, who had taken shrapnel to his shoulder, but refused evacuation until the bridge situation was resolved. The men whispered among themselves about Major's chances, with most believing the dog had been killed during the crossing or captured by Germans who would recognize the military equipment and search for messages. Sullivan refused to accept that Major was gone, keeping watch through a gap in the factory wall that offered a view across the rubble-strewn ground between their position and the city center. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his rifle, not from fear, but from the emotional weight of having sent his closest companion into almost certain death. Other soldiers in the platoon had come to respect Major during their time in France, where the dog had proven himself repeatedly under fire, and several men now stood watch alongside Sullivan, hoping to spot the German shepherd returning through the smoke. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, casting long shadows across Nijmegen, when Sullivan suddenly tensed and grabbed the shoulder of the soldier beside him. There, across 300 yards of open ground between shattered buildings, was a dark shape moving with purposeful speed toward the factory, staying low and pausing frequently to scan for threats. Sullivan's heart leaped as he recognized Major's distinctive gait and the way the dog moved his head while navigating obstacles, but his joy instantly mixed with terror as he saw what else was moving in that deadly space. A German patrol of 6 soldiers was advancing from the north on a path that would intersect with Major's route in less than a minute. The patrol appeared to be conducting a sweep of the area, searching buildings and checking bodies, preparing the ground for their evening offensive. Sullivan could not shoot without revealing the factory position and bringing down overwhelming fire on his weakened platoon, but watching Major walk into an enemy patrol without warning was unbearable. Sullivan made a split-second decision that violated every tactical rule drilled into him during training, but felt absolutely right in his gut and heart. He grabbed a loose brick from the rubble around him and hurled it with all his strength toward a burnt truck chassis 30 yards to the left of Major's position. The brick hit the metal with a loud clang that echoed across the battlefield, immediately drawing the attention of the German patrol. The enemy soldiers swung their weapons toward the sound and began advancing cautiously toward the truck, believing they had detected an American position. In that moment of distraction, Major sensed danger and changed direction, moving behind a collapsed wall that concealed him from the patrol while they investigated the noise. Sullivan held his breath as Germans searched around the truck, finding nothing but growing suspicious that something was wrong in this sector. Major remained hidden until the patrol moved past his position, then resumed his journey, taking a more circuitous route that added distance but provided better cover from observation. Sullivan watched every yard of that agonizing progress as his dog navigated a landscape designed to kill anything that moved. Twice more Major had to freeze when German soldiers appeared, but the gathering dusk worked in his favor, making the dark-furred dog nearly invisible against shadowed rubble. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was actually 17 minutes, Major reached the factory perimeter and squeezed through the same gap in the wall that Sullivan had used to release him hours earlier. Sullivan rushed to meet Major in the interior courtyard, dropping to his knees and embracing the exhausted dog, while other soldiers gathered around, cheering softly and patting Major's dusty coat with genuine affection and relief. Sullivan's hands shook as he removed the metal cylinder from Major's collar and extracted the folded paper inside that bore Colonel Henderson's handwriting. The message was brief, but contained exactly what the platoon desperately needed to hear, with orders to maintain their position until 2200 hours, when a coordinated assault would commence with armor support and artillery preparation targeting known German strongpoints. Henderson's note also confirmed that air support would be available at first light if the bridge remained standing, and promised ammunition resupply would be dropped to forward positions once the attack began. Sullivan read the message aloud to Morris and the other soldiers, who responded with renewed determination, now that they knew their sacrifice holding this position had purpose and reinforcements were actually coming. Morris immediately began organizing the platoon's defense for the next 4 hours, knowing that German forces would likely probe their position as darkness fell. Sullivan was assigned to care for Major, who was limping slightly on his right foreleg and showing signs of exhaustion after his harrowing double-crossing of enemy-controlled territory. Sullivan found a relatively intact corner of the factory where he gave Major water from his canteen and shared his last ration bar with the dog, who ate hungrily. While Sullivan checked Major for injuries, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. A bullet had grazed Major's left flank, leaving a shallow wound that had bled, but was not life-threatening. The dog had been shot during his return journey, but had continued the mission anyway, driven by training and loyalty that transcended pain and fear. Sullivan carefully cleaned and bandaged the wound using supplies from his medical kit, while whispering thanks to Major for completing a mission that no human could have survived. The other soldiers came by to check on Major, treating the dog with the same respect they would show any wounded comrade who had performed an act of extraordinary valor. Word spread through the platoon about what Major had accomplished, and the bullet wound that proved how close the dog had come to dying while carrying the message that would save their lives. One soldier remarked that Major deserved a medal, and others agreed, though everyone knew that official recognition for animals was complicated and often denied by military bureaucracy, focused only on human achievement. As darkness enveloped Nijmegen, the sound of battle intensified across the city, with German and American forces maneuvering for advantage before the promised assault on the bridge. Sullivan remained with Major, listening to the distant rumble of tanks moving into position and the sharp crack of rifles as scouts probed enemy lines. Morris appeared in the doorway and told Sullivan that he and Major were being pulled from the front line for the coming assault, with orders to move to a safer position in the rear. Sullivan started to protest, wanting to be with his unit during the critical fight, but Morris cut him off, explaining that Major had already done more than any soldier could ask and deserved to survive this war. Sullivan reluctantly accepted the order, understanding that Morris was right and that his primary duty now was protecting the dog who had saved them all. At 2100 hours, Sullivan and Major moved through the darkness toward the battalion aid station, established in a factory basement 4 blocks from the bridge. The streets were crowded with soldiers preparing for the assault, with officers checking equipment and medics organizing stretchers for the wounded. They knew were coming. Sullivan found a quiet corner, where he sat with Major's head resting on his lap, while explosions began to thunder across Nijmegen, signaling the start of the artillery bombardment that would precede the infantry attack. Through the basement windows, Sullivan could see tracers arcing through the night sky and hear the distinctive sound of American tanks grinding forward toward the bridge. He whispered to Major that they had done their part, and now other men would finish the job they had started, with a desperate message carried through enemy fire by the bravest dog he had ever known. The assault on Nijmegen Bridge began precisely at 2200 hours, with such violence that the ground shook continuously and dust fell from the basement ceiling where Sullivan sheltered with Major. American artillery pounded German positions on both ends of the bridge, while tank destroyers fired directly at the concrete pillboxes defending the southern approach. Infantry companies that had been hiding in the ruins all day suddenly surged forward in coordinated waves, supported by the armor that Colonel Henderson had promised in his message. Sullivan listened to the battle through the walls, knowing that his platoon was somewhere in that inferno, fighting to reach the bridge before German engineers could trigger the demolition charges that would destroy the crossing and doom Operation Market Garden to failure. Major stirred restlessly beside Sullivan, sensing the urgency and chaos above ground, where his training told him he should be working to help wounded soldiers or carry additional messages. Sullivan stroked Major's head and spoke calmly to keep the dog from bolting toward the sound of combat, where his instincts pulled him, despite his exhaustion and injury. A medic working nearby commented that he had never seen such a devoted pair and asked about Major's background. Sullivan explained the Dogs for Defense program and how Major had been donated by a civilian family who probably spent every day wondering if their pet was still alive somewhere in Europe. The medic listened while treating wounded men being carried down from the street battles and remarked that Major had probably saved more lives today than most soldiers would in an entire war. Hours passed in that basement, with the tempo of battle ebbing and flowing, as American forces pushed forward block by block against fanatical German resistance. Wounded soldiers arrived in streams with medics working frantically to stabilize the worst cases before they could be evacuated to rear area hospitals. Sullivan helped where he could, holding plasma bottles and carrying stretchers, while Major remained close, demonstrating the same calm under pressure that had made him invaluable during training. Around midnight, a runner burst into the aid station shouting that American forces had reached the southern end of the bridge and were fighting room to clear the German defenders. Everyone in the basement cheered, knowing that success was within reach if the bridge could be taken before dawn. Sullivan was carrying a wounded sergeant to a corner of the basement when a massive explosion shook the entire building with such force that the lights went out and men were thrown to the floor. For a terrible moment, Sullivan feared that the bridge had been destroyed, but then he heard cheering from soldiers near the entrance. A lieutenant appeared in the doorway announcing that the explosion had been American engineers blowing open a German bunker, not the bridge demolition. Fighting continued through the night, with Germans surrendering in small groups as they realized their position was hopeless and American reinforcements kept arriving. Sullivan returned to Major, who had remained calm throughout the explosion, showing the remarkable temperament that separated working war dogs from ordinary pets. Dawn on September 18th brought news that transformed exhaustion into jubilation, as word spread that the Nijmegen Bridge had been captured intact with German demolition charges discovered and disarmed just minutes before they would have been triggered. American and British tanks were already rolling across the span, heading north toward Arnhem, where paratroopers still held a desperate perimeter waiting for relief. Sullivan emerged from the basement with Major into a grey morning where soldiers were celebrating in the streets despite their losses and fatigue. Morris appeared looking exhausted, but alive with his wounded shoulder bandaged, and found Sullivan to report that the platoon had suffered 3 killed and 7 wounded during the final assault, but had accomplished their mission. Morris knelt beside Major and said that without the intelligence the dog had carried, they would have attacked blindly and lost many more men in the process. Colonel Henderson visited the aid station later that morning to personally thank Sullivan and see Major, who had become something of a legend among the 82nd Airborne troops who heard the story of his double crossing through enemy fire. Henderson brought a photographer from the Signal Corps who documented Major's bullet wound and took pictures of Sullivan with his dog for the division newspaper. Henderson explained that he was recommending Major for recognition, though he acknowledged that the military had complex rules about decorating animals, and the outcome was uncertain. What mattered more to Henderson was ensuring that everyone knew how a donated family pet from Ohio had directly contributed to the capture of the most important bridge in Operation Market Garden by delivering the message that coordinated the final assault. Sullivan learned that his platoon was being rotated to a rest area outside Nijmegen for 3 days to recover from their losses and receive replacement troops and equipment. He was told to take Major to the division veterinary unit, where the dog's injuries could be properly treated and documented for the official record. The veterinary tent was crowded with other war dogs who had been wounded during the fighting, including a scout dog who had lost an eye to shrapnel and a mine detection dog with a badly burned paw. The veterinarian Captain Rachel Morrison examined Major carefully and praised Sullivan for the field treatment that had prevented infection. Morrison explained that Major's wound would heal completely within 2 weeks, and the dog would be able to return to duty if Sullivan and the division commanders wanted him back in action. Sullivan faced a difficult choice as he watched Morrison bandage Major's wound with professional care that reminded him how much these animals sacrificed for human conflicts they could not understand. Part of him wanted Major far from combat in some rear area job, or even sent home to America, where the dog would be safe from bullets and bombs. But Sullivan also knew that Major was a working dog who found purpose in the missions they performed together, and that separating them would be emotionally devastating for both. Morrison sensed Sullivan's internal struggle and shared that she faced the same dilemma with every wounded dog that came through her tent. She told Sullivan that the dogs donated through Dogs for Defense had volunteered through their families and deserved the same respect for their service that human soldiers received, including the right to continue serving if they were capable. Over the next 3 days, while the 82nd Airborne consolidated their hold on Nijmegen and British forces pushed north toward Arnhem, Sullivan spent most of his time with Major away from the immediate combat zone. They walked through the liberated Dutch city, where civilians emerged from hiding to thank American soldiers with flowers and food and celebration. Children crowded around Major, petting his fur and calling him a hero in Dutch words Sullivan could not understand, but whose meaning was clear. An elderly woman who spoke some English approached Sullivan and explained that her son had been shot by Germans for resistance activities and that she considered Major and all the Allied soldiers to be angels sent to free her country from years of brutal occupation. Sullivan received a letter from Morris explaining that the platoon had been assigned to defensive positions around Nijmegen, while British forces attempted to break through to Arnhem, where the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Morris wrote that the intelligence Major had carried ultimately contributed to capturing the bridge, but could not solve the larger problems facing Operation Market Garden, including German resistance, that was far stronger than anyone had anticipated. Sullivan read between the lines, understanding that many men were dying to the north, while he rested in relative safety with Major. The guilt of survival haunted him, as it did every soldier who lived while comrades fell, but Morrison reminded him that taking care of Major was a legitimate mission, and that his turn to return to combat would come soon enough. On September 21st, Sullivan and Major rejoined their platoon at a position overlooking the WWII River, where engineers were constructing pontoon bridges to supplement the captured road span. The mood among the troops was somber, as news arrived that British paratroopers in Arnhem were being evacuated across the Rhine after suffering catastrophic casualties, with Operation Market Garden deemed a strategic failure despite the tactical success at Nijmegen. Sullivan learned that 5 men from his original platoon had been killed during follow-up operations, and Morris had been evacuated to England after his shoulder wound became infected. The new platoon leader, Lieutenant Hayes, was a young officer fresh from the States who knew Sullivan's reputation and immediately asked if Major was ready to resume messenger duties. Sullivan confirmed that Major was fully healed and capable of working, but requested that the dog be used only for critical missions where radio communication was impossible. Hayes agreed, noting that the division had acquired better radio equipment and that the front lines around Nijmegen were more stable than during the initial assault. For the next 6 weeks, Sullivan and Major performed routine patrols and security duties as Allied forces prepared for winter operations and the long push toward Germany. The fame of Major's bridge crossing spread through the division, with soldiers from other units asking to meet the dog who had carried the message that captured Nijmegen. Sullivan was proud of Major, but also protective, knowing that fame could lead to Major being used recklessly to boost morale or public relations rather than for genuine military necessity. In early November, Captain Morrison visited Sullivan's position with unexpected news that Major had been selected to return to the United States for a war bond tour showcasing the Dogs for Defense program and encouraging more civilians to donate pets for military service. Sullivan's immediate reaction was relief that Major would escape the coming winter campaign, but that feeling was quickly replaced by loss at the thought of being separated from the companion who had shared every danger and hardship since they trained together in Virginia. Morrison explained that Sullivan could accompany Major on the tour if he chose, with the division willing to grant him temporary leave for public relations duties. Sullivan requested time to consider the offer, struggling between his duty to his platoon and his bond with Major, who had saved his life and the lives of countless other soldiers through courage and loyalty. That evening, Sullivan sat with Major near the river watching November twilight settle over Nijmegen and the bridge that had cost so many lives to capture. He thought about the family in Ohio who had donated Major to the war effort and whether they would want their dog returned or whether Major truly belonged to Sullivan now, after everything they had experienced together. He remembered Morris saying that Major deserved to survive this war, and Morrison saying that the dogs volunteered through their families and deserved respect for their service. Sullivan realized that Major's story could inspire thousands of Americans to support the war effort, and that refusing the bond tour would be selfish when the larger mission required public engagement and support. He also understood that taking Major away from combat was the greatest gift he could give to a dog who had already given everything. Sullivan informed Lieutenant Hayes the next morning that he and Major would accept the assignment to return to America for the war bond tour scheduled to begin in December. Hayes understood the decision and told Sullivan that his experience and Major's heroism would do more good at home than in one more winter foxhole in Holland. Sullivan spent his final days with the platoon, documenting Major's service record and ensuring that the story of the Nijmegen Bridge message was properly recorded in official reports. Several soldiers asked Sullivan to write letters to their families, mentioning Major, and how the dog represented everything good and loyal in a world consumed by violence. Sullivan wrote those letters carefully, knowing that for families who had lost sons, the story of Major might provide small comfort, that their boys had been supported by companions who never abandoned them, regardless of danger. Sullivan and Major departed from Nijmegen on December 3rd, aboard a transport truck that took them to Brussels, and then to an airfield where they would fly to England before crossing the Atlantic. The journey felt surreal after months of combat, with clean uniforms, hot meals, and beds that were not muddy foxholes. In London, Sullivan was briefed by public relations officers about the bond tour that would take them to 15 cities over 2 months, with Major appearing at rallies and parades, while Sullivan told the story of the bridge crossing. The officers emphasized that the tour was designed to increase donations to the Dogs for Defense program, which desperately needed more animals as the war expanded across Europe and the Pacific. Sullivan agreed to follow the schedule, but insisted that Major's welfare come first with adequate rest and veterinary care at every stop. The ship crossing the Atlantic took 8 days through rough December seas that left Sullivan seasick, but Major seemed unbothered by the motion. Other soldiers aboard the transport gathered to hear about Nijmegen and see the dog who had become famous through newspaper articles and radio broadcasts that preceded their arrival. Sullivan answered questions patiently, but avoided embellishing the facts, knowing that the truth was dramatic enough without Hollywood exaggeration. He spoke about the other war dogs who had served with less recognition and the handlers who had trained and cared for them, including several men who had been killed before their dogs could be evacuated. Sullivan wanted audiences to understand that Major represented thousands of animals serving in multiple theaters, and that every dog deserved the recognition that circumstances and luck had given to one German shepherd from Ohio. The tour began in New York City on December 18th, with a rally in Times Square where 10,000 people gathered to see Major and hear Sullivan speak. Sullivan was nervous addressing such a large crowd, but Major remained calm beside him as flashbulbs popped and reporters shouted questions. Sullivan told the story, simply focusing on the bridge and the message and the bullet wound that Major had sustained while completing his mission. He showed the actual metal cylinder that had carried Colonel Henderson's orders and explained how dogs were trained to navigate battlefields using scent and memory. The crowd cheered wildly when Sullivan finished, and donations to the Dogs for Defense program increased dramatically that week, proving that the tour was achieving its intended purpose. Over the following weeks, Sullivan and Major traveled to Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, and a dozen other cities, repeating the story and meeting families who had donated dogs or lost sons in the war. Sullivan found these private meetings more meaningful than the public rallies because he could speak honestly about what their sacrifices meant to soldiers fighting overseas. One family in Detroit had donated a Doberman who was killed by a mine in the Pacific, and they thanked Sullivan through tears for showing that their dog's service mattered. Another family in Cleveland wanted to donate their collie after seeing Major, but Sullivan carefully explained that not every dog was suitable for military work, and that supporting the war effort took many forms, including factory work and conservation efforts at home. In February 1945, Sullivan and Major made their final tour stop in Columbus, Ohio, just 60 miles from the small town where Major's original family lived. The public relations officers had arranged a reunion between Major and the family, who had donated him with photographers and newsreel cameras, ready to capture the emotional moment. Sullivan was anxious about how Major would react after nearly 2 years apart from the people who had raised him from a puppy. The family arrived at the hotel where Sullivan was staying, including a mother, father, and 2 teenage children, who rushed forward calling Major's name. Major recognized them instantly, his tail wagging furiously as he jumped and licked faces, demonstrating that memory and love transcended time and distance. Sullivan watched, feeling both joy that Major was reunited with his family and sadness that this moment might mean goodbye to the companion who had saved his life. The family from Ohio sat with Sullivan for hours, sharing stories about Major as a puppy and asking detailed questions about his service in Europe. The father explained that donating Major had been the hardest decision they ever made, but they believed deeply that defeating fascism required every American to sacrifice what they held most precious. The mother cried while examining Major's scars, including the bullet graze from Nijmegen, and said she was grateful her dog had survived when so many soldiers had not. The children, now 16 and 14, had followed Major's story through newspapers and felt immense pride that their family pet had become a national hero. Sullivan told them everything about Major's training missions and the bridge crossing, making clear that their dog had directly saved American lives through courage and skill that exceeded what anyone thought possible for an animal. The question everyone avoided finally emerged when the public relations officer asked whether the family wanted Major returned to them now that the Bond tour was complete. The father looked at his children and then at Sullivan before answering that Major clearly belonged with Sullivan now, after everything they had experienced together. He explained that the dog they had donated was not the same animal sitting before them, just as the young men who went to war were not the same boys who returned. The mother agreed, adding that separating Sullivan and Major would be cruel after they had formed a bond forged in combat that transcended the relationship between pet and owner. Sullivan felt overwhelming relief and gratitude as he realized that Major would remain his partner for whatever lay ahead, whether that meant returning to Europe or beginning a new life after the war ended. Sullivan and Major returned to military duty in March 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and drove into the heart of Germany. The 82nd Airborne was preparing for a combat jump into Berlin that was ultimately cancelled when Soviet forces reached the city first. Sullivan and Major, instead, participated in occupation duties in Bavaria, where they helped process surrendering German soldiers and search for hidden weapons caches. The war in Europe ended on May 8th, and Sullivan learned that he had enough service points to qualify for discharge by summer. He immediately applied for permission to adopt Major through the military program that allowed handlers to keep their dogs after demobilization. The request was approved in June, with Morrison personally delivering the paperwork that officially made Major a civilian dog owned by Private Sullivan, who would himself become civilian James Sullivan in a matter of weeks. Sullivan returned to Pennsylvania in August 1945, with Major beside him on a train crowded with veterans heading home to uncertain futures. He had no clear plan beyond finding work and a place to live, but he knew that whatever he did would include Major, who had earned the right to a peaceful retirement. Sullivan eventually found a job at a factory and a small house on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, where Major spent his days sleeping in the sun and his evenings walking with Sullivan through quiet neighborhoods far from battlefields and bridges. Sullivan never spoke much about the war, except when veterans groups asked him to share Major's story at events honoring military dogs and their handlers. He always emphasized that Major was one of thousands of dogs who served with distinction, and that the families who donated their pets were the true heroes who made victory possible. Major lived until 1952, dying peacefully at home surrounded by Sullivan and the family Sullivan had started after the war, including a wife and 2 young children who knew Major only as a gentle old dog who had once been very brave. Sullivan buried Major in his backyard under an oak tree and placed a simple marker that read, Major German Shepherd 82nd Airborne Nijmegen Bridge, September 1944. Sullivan lived another 40 years, often thinking about that desperate afternoon when he sent his best friend into enemy fire carrying a message that changed the course of a battle. He never regretted the decision, because Major had fulfilled the purpose that a family in Ohio had chosen when they donated their beloved pet to help win a war against tyranny. The bridge still stands in Nijmegen, and every year, on September 18th, veterans gather to remember the soldiers who captured it and honor the courage of all who served, including a dog who carried hope through fire.